Members, we turn now to the Radio New Zealand Amendment Bill. When we were last debating this bill, leave had been granted for all provisions to be taken as one question for the purpose of debate. Chris Farfoy had the call and he has 4 minutes and 12 seconds remaining. Should he wish to avail himself of that opportunity?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will avail myself of that opportunity to complete the speech which I began on July the 1st, 2015. And I guess that shows you the priority in which the current government has given public broadcasting. I will come back to the background to the bill, which will outline a pretty sorry tale of neglect and delay from the government. But I did want, because we are taking all parts as one question, I did want to take the opportunity to point out that broadcasting and Radio New Zealand and how we get news out to people has changed considerably. And a sign of that, Mr. Chair, happened in the very suburb that I live in Titahi Bay this morning, where the mast which once carried the radio signal of Radio New Zealand out to New Zealand and further afield was felled. It's been up there for decades and as part of the landscape in my neck of the woods now. It is no longer because at 9 o'clock this morning, someone pushed a button, some explosives went off and the radio mast that once stood there proudly as a beacon for all the locals to know exactly where they were at a particular time of night. Is no longer there. So I guess that's a real signal that happened today that broadcasting as we know it has changed and is changing and will continue to change. And I think that's why there has been some disappointment from this side of the House as to the delay as to the passage of this piece of legislation through the House. A part of this legislation ensures that there is a 5-yearly review of Radio New Zealand and its functions and its operations. And one of those reviews was to happen in 2010. That review hasn't happened because this piece of legislation has languished on the order paper. And if you do the maths, then also another review of Radio New Zealand and its operations and its functions should have happened by rights about this time or late last year. But that also hasn't happened. So that is a sorry tale of public broadcasting under this current government, and I think it shows also it shows just another example of its delay and neglect of public broadcasting when you put it into the context of what used to be and what is now no longer. And I'm pointing towards TVNZ 6 and TVNZ 7, which were the two digital channels which were started up by our other supposed state broadcaster, TVNZ. Back in my day at TVNZ, actually, I think it was 2008 that channel was started. And also the TVNZ 6 station, which I think was a real loss to lose because of the content that it had for our children. It was free to air, mostly New Zealand content, of a New Zealand feel, educational, and gave our children a sense of what it was to be a New Zealander at a young age and good content there. But unfortunately, Mr. Chair, because of the overall attitude of the government, that has gone, and we are debating this Radio New Zealand Amendment Bill also today, which has been delayed. And I look to the quite substantive SOP in the Minister's name, I think it's SOP 94, Mr. Chair, and look at the first substantive note in the explanatory note, and that is the change in the commencement. Clause 2 is amended to substitute a new commencement date as the date in the clause has passed. So there you have it in the first lines of the explanatory note within the SOP that the Minister has put up. It has admitted that the commencement date has passed. It's not just passed though, Mr. Chair, it's passed by a good 5.5 years, which I think is a reflection of the government's priority around public broadcasting. But I did want to point to what I think is a substantive SOP within a clause within the Minister's SOP, and that is the inserting of a new clause 8AB, and that's around commercial free broadcasting, Mr. Chair. And if I could take the liberty of reading this, just so those at home, either listening or watching this on the internet later, can be fully aware of what I'm talking about. It does go to say that the public radio company, and that is Radio New Zealand, or RNZ as we know it now, in fulfilling its charter, provides its services in a commercial-free manner, but it can offer some commercial services if the provision of these services is A, consistent with its role as a public broadcaster, does not impact adversely on provision of its services under the Charter. Sorry, just turn the page. And it also allows Radio New Zealand, or RNZ as we know it now, to provide media services to countries outside New Zealand other than Radio New Zealand International, or any radio services that might replace in whole, Mr Chair.
Chris Farfoy.
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. I'll just go back to the start of that. And services that might replace in whole or in part Radio New Zealand International. That is essentially saying, Mr Chair, that RNZ, as we know it now, can provide content to overseas broadcasters, and it doesn't matter whether or not there is commercials on that broadcaster. It's very similar to the setup that they've got with the BBC, of which I also have some knowledge in working for, because the BBC World Channel, as we know it, and which we watch to get our international news, is a commercial arm of the BBC. It is allowed to sell advertising, but you won't see that content within the UK, because the BBC in its purest form in the UK is non-commercial, but there is a revenue stream allowed to be had with the BBC World Television Service, which I used to work for. There is a good side and a bad side to this, Mr Chair. Good in that it opens up another revenue stream for RNZ to get in funds, to be able to do more of the things that we'd like it to see. But there is a tension there from this side of the House in the fact that for the last 8 years, we've seen a funding freeze at Radio New Zealand. And that has affected its ability to do its core services to the point where I believe, Mr Chair, that at select committee stages, that at the select committee, when asked by our broadcasting spokesperson, Claire Curran, the board chair and the chief executive have been quite frank in the fact that they have been under extreme pressure to deliver their services under the frozen budget. If I could take this opportunity to directly quote them, because I don't want to get them quote them wrong. Mr Chair, I think this was at the annual review of Radio New Zealand with the Commerce Committee. The board chair, I believe, said, "I'd say our financials are healthy as they possibly could be under the circumstances of a budget that hasn't increased in terms of government financing." I think they're being a little bit polite there. And they went on to say to Claire Curran, "The impact of inflation has eroded our purchasing power, but we are getting to the point where those limited rations are getting more and more difficult to handle." And I'm quite happy to go on the record about that. So that is people in management positions, Mr Chair, who are talking about delivering those core functions which are in this SOP, about delivering good news services, good content services to New Zealanders, who are worried that their job of doing that is constrained by the fact that the government has frozen its budget for the last 8 years. And I would ask that a minister in the chair at some stage during this committee debate elaborate with the House about how it is going to help Radio New Zealand achieve some of the objectives within this amended legislation when that budget has been frozen. Because I think that is a serious challenge that the government has put itself under. While it has aspirations to have a strong public broadcaster, Mr Chair, it certainly hasn't backed up those aspirations with the taxpayers' ability to fund RNZ. I do praise them for opening up another revenue stream by using commercial means to do that. Most public broadcasters around the world do that. But I think it would also show a decent amount of commitment from the government itself if it backed up its aspirations for RNZ or Radio New Zealand, or however you want to describe it, if they backed that up with actual funding that helped meet it, reach its priorities.
Ask the member, because he's travelled widely, this particular aspect, which isn't part of the bill in front of him. So can he now bring himself, now he's been given some latitude, to come back to what's in front of him?
Thank you very much, Mr Chair. I'm not going to question that ruling, but I think because it was this is a wide-ranging debate on all questions, I was allowed some latitude on the issue. Mr Chair, also around the lack of reviews over the last 8 years, if there hasn't been a review in 2010 and there hasn't been a review in 2015, and this piece of legislation implements a review every 5 years, I would ask that the government commit in this process to making sure there is more than just a standard review at its next opportunity, and I hope the government will take the next available opportunity to have a broad review of Radio New Zealand, that it does take a really good look at the functions and the operations, and if I might say, Mr Chair, the funding of Radio New Zealand, because we are now 2 reviews out. The public and the Radio New Zealand have deserved 2 reviews of its functions in 2010 and 2015, but because of this government's inability to get this piece of legislation through, we haven't got there.
Tracy Martin.